Camptown ladies sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah. Camptown racetrack 5 miles long, all the doo-dah day. One run all night, one run all day. Let find money on the bobtail egg, somebody bet on the bay. One run all night, one run all day. Let find money on the bobtail egg.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here?
So yeah, today we're talking about the class struggle surrounding the creation of the Constitution with the aid of Charles Beard. Most people, I would guess, probably haven't heard of him, but in his time, he was probably the biggest public intellectual in the U.S., especially a couple decades after this was written in the 1930s during the New Deal. He was described as a Marxist by supporters and detractors alike, but in reality, he was like a progressive historian he had some connections to the Socialist Party, and like a very similar methodology to historical materialism, but, we can get into how it's a little bit different later. So I read his 1913 work, Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, and that at the time earned him a lot of ire from the capitalist and the political classes of his time. Apparently, President Taft said he admitted that what Beard wrote was all true enough, but he said something along the lines of, "Why did the bastard have to go and write it?"
Literally the Simpsons bit. It's true, but he shouldn't say it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, if you're interested in his biography, and especially his later career as like a devout anti-imperialist, I'd recommend checking out, there's an episode of the podcast Parallax Views with one of Beard's biographers, Richard Drake. But anyway, we're here to talk about the Constitution. So his general thesis lost a lot of credibility during the Cold War when his kind of democratic and materialist critique came under the spotlight of like a hegemonic anti-communism of the time, which is kind of why he still isn't taken seriously today. At least that's why I think he isn't taken seriously. I couldn't find it when I was preparing for this podcast, but I think I saw a Wikipedia page at one point that said his economic interpretation was quote unquote discredited, and that ideas were the driving force behind the adoption of the Constitution, which just goes to show you how the ruling class is still invested in this like metaphysical idealism as a philosophical framework. But I personally found his analysis pretty useful, and I just want to ask what were people's basic impression of this and the class struggle around the Constitution generally?
I mean, I think he was correct in that he was willing to ask the question that at the time no one wanted to ask, which was, why did these guys really do what they said they were doing? What were their actual interests as opposed to the fictive idealist notions that we kind of told ourselves throughout history, and as such, it's very valuable in that respect, and it makes class and the position of different classes within the revolutionary generation more visible, and that's good.
Yeah, I think he really doubles down on the marriage of political economy. You can't really understand one without the other, and this is like cannot really be separated, which is like kind of fundamentally a Marxist position. I mean, I remember in high school reading Founding Brothers. You know, have you ever read that book by Ellis or whatever? And it left a huge impression on me. I was like, I became a dyed in the wool. I mean, I was like a Republican at the time, like big R, like not good type Republican. And it was like a big deal for me. I was like, I'm a classical liberal. And I was like, I deified Jefferson and Adams and these guys, which I guess is the point of the book. And this is like a perfect antidote to that, because I mean, the founders of the Constitution or the framers are just, they're just fucking people with money, the same as people with money are today. And I think, there's parts of the book where you really get that feeling when he goes through the political doctrines and you read what some of these guys say. I mean, just the sheer volume and diversity of different ideas going into it, and how you had a certain amount of people who were like wanting to reconstitute a monarchy, and certain people that were more democratic of the kind of Pennsylvania Constitution direction. You just, yeah, there's no way that you can come off with the idea that this was somehow ordained by God, which is kind of like the fetish that's presented to, within American kind of education or whatever.
It was either inspired by God or it was revealed just by the sheer brilliance of the founders themselves. Either way, it was a revelation. And what's so baffling about that notion persisting is the one thing we know because of the records of it is how much of a hashed bargain and a hillbilly auction the Constitution really was. I mean, the idea that any principles were able to transcend what was an entirely a horse trading mechanism is kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's funny to me because we very much do have this common conception in the 21st century that there's this straight line from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, where in Beard's schema, it's kind of like a Thermidorian reaction in a way, where there were plebeian elements, or at least this kind of popular front against British against the British Empire in 1776, but he sees the Constitution as the triumph of the upcoming like mercantilist, proto-capitalists against the democratic subsistence farmers. And I think there are some issues with that. Like I think he glazes over the Southern planters. He doesn't really give a political economic analysis of the South, but there are points where you can glean that the Constitution was this kind of deal struck between the Northern capitalists and the Southern slave owners, right? Like where he says Georgia, the Constitution was ratified so fast. Yeah, and I think talking about today's current ideas about the Revolutionary War and the founding and all that, you have these kind of two narratives that have opposite conclusions but kind of the same analysis, which is the Lin-Manuel Miranda version, right? Which is that Hamilton and all them were the progressive uniters of the nation, and the really weird moral shit that play does act like the Federalists were the moralistic anti-slavery people, which is just not true at all. And then you have the 1619 thing, right, which is basically the same narrative but flipped on its head and said, oh this is bad, and that 1776 was a counter-revolution, and the Revolutionary War to the founding of the Constitution was all one smooth process. And I think both of those are kind of wrong, right? Because I think Beard is right about these plebeian elements, especially, around Shays' Rebellion and stuff like that, where they were, demanding... there's literally this one quote from General Henry Knox, who was sent to put down Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, to George Washington, where he says, I have the quote written down here, it says, "The people who are the insurgents have never paid any but very little taxes, but they see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own property compared with the opulent, and their own forests, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be common property to all. And that attempts in opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice, blah, blah, blah." That's pretty that's basically a proto-communist thing, right? Calling for common property for all. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit here, but I think he is right about the democratic elements being kind of put down in the process of the founding of the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't get a continent-wide convulsion like the U.S. Constitution. You don't get regular people fighting for independence without something in their mind other than what they got. But the sort of historical process that the revolution was part of, which really was the liberation of American capital, really, from the mercantile structures of the British Empire, meant that once the war was over and once the insufficiencies, and inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation were manifest, that the only dynamic forces that would be able to take that initiative were going to be those around capital, and that is why they ended up dictating the terms of the new Constitution. Also, why so many of the real contradictions inherent in this process, the hidden Leviathan, sort of, that was implied and necessitated by the attempt to make the United States into a national project that could compete with European powers, had to be obscured. And a lot of the stuff, I think, that gets fetishized about the Constitution, its guarantees of liberty, end up being either completely organized around defending the prerogatives of Southern slavery, which was sort of as a political economy, was sort of like the junior partner to Northern, the merchant economy, and also it's either that or it's an attempt to sort of hide the real implications of what was being built, what had to be built, because there is sort of there's a case to be made, and I think a correct case, that Hamilton and the Federalists were progressive in a historical function, like in their role, but where we get off, where we always get off base when we're talking about American history, certainly more than anything, the founding era, is trying to put a contemporary moral framework around that designation. Like, that makes them the good guys in some moral sense. And that's where I think we get a lot of the confusion about it, and a lot of the mystification around the actual interests that went into creating the Constitution.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about this a bit earlier. Like, the idea of the term progressive for Marxists isn't that, in the colloquial sense, that it's good. It's that it moves history forward on the basis that makes, socialism possible, which is basically the primitive accumulation of capital, the, horrible genocidal shit that happens with the closing of the commons and all that.
This was a question that really concerned me when I was reading it initially, is I kept wondering, you can really only judge the Constitution or really any kind of historical event or decision making on the basis of what alternatives there were at the time. And I don't really think that there was a meaningful alternative. I mean, even with Parker, you're talking about the kind of plebeian masses and this kind of democratic agrarian petty proprietor thing. I mean, even with that being said, and one kind of sees why Mike Davis calls the American Revolution the purest of the bourgeois revolutions, is because it's just not as much an element as it was with others. And there had yet to be the sort of factory system implemented in the United States to the extent that it was in England at the time. And you see that the whole book is filled with quotes from Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and Washington, who have this abject fear of proletarianization and the basically seeing the appearance and the birth of the conditions which Engels would later write about, in the conditions of the English working class. I guess if you're looking at it, I think you're right, Matt. It's impossible to kind of moralize it. You know what I mean? You have to kind of analyze it based on, were there other options? And I think at the end of the day, although to quote Matt as the progenitor of this conversation, the Constitution is fucking dog shit, and it does need to be abolished ASAP, and that should be a fundamental fucking demand of any socialist movement in the United States. We actually have to shrug that thing off and have a constitutional convention, like good democratic countries like Cuba did in 2018. But I think at the time, especially considering the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, and two, the immense dire straits economically, the depression that the United States was under during the 1780s. I do think the Constitution ends up its role in like Hamilton's role as a centralizer and like establishing the first U.S. bank and all this comes across as being like, yeah, progressive in a state building world historic sense, if that makes sense.
Like the lack of an alternative, I think, is dictated by the exceptional, if you will, circumstance of America at that point, where this proto-proletariat you're talking about are still operating from a conception of autonomy and political liberty that is inherently hostile to the notion of like a suborning of personal liberty to any kind of greater authority at all, which means that their ability to articulate any kind of alternative to Hamiltonianism is non-existent. And that's why all of that pre-proletarian energy ends up getting absorbed by like Jeffersonianism, which is like the closest thing to an alternative to emerge, which is itself predicated entirely on race-based chattel slavery.
Yeah, I think, the different, like, Christian, you brought up, the other bourgeois revolutions. I think, comparing what, in a relatively short time frame, the American Revolution to the French Revolution, one of the main differences is you have these, manufactories in Paris and all that. And France's borders are closed. It's a small country, and you don't have, lands you can expand to. So you do have an emerging like sans culotte, like proto-proletariat that's able to at least have a huge impact on the French Revolution to put forward or at least influence its bourgeois spokespeople like Robespierre and stuff to call for the abolition of slavery and have a relatively democratic constitution in 1793. 94, but in the United States, you do have this democratic plebeian subsistence farmer element, which is like one of the only times in American history you have like a real peasantry. That and like the sharecroppers later on, but basically at that point there was this huge debt crisis, right? And the capitalists were being shaken down by the European powers for hard currency like gold, silver, etc. And you have all the states during the war issuing their own paper currency, getting devalued to fuck, 40, 100 times devalued. So you have this, agrarian, what in Rhode Island they were called like the Country Party, right? And they're made up of like Quakers who were, one, against slavery, two, wanted a system that had basically a House of Representatives and that's it. So like a democratic legislature, like the Pennsylvania Constitution, compared to what ended up happening with the Senate and the indirect election of the presidency and the judicial check, the aristocratic judicial check on Congress and all that. So yeah, I think Matt, you're right that there wasn't an alternative because the democratic element at that time was not strong enough to overthrow the ruling classes, but also it wasn't linking up with the proto working class too, which is the dock workers and all that in basically the only three cities that existed at the time: Boston, New York, and Baltimore. A lot of them were freedmen, black workers, and during Shays' Rebellion, there's no attempt to hook up with the working class of Boston. It probably wouldn't have worked anyway, but you're right that it was kind of an inevitability because the proto-capitalists and the slave owners, which had a temporary alliance in the formation of the Constitution, were really hegemonic. There was no way to beat them at that point.
And everybody's idea of liberty could boil down to get me some more land to work myself, because of the frontier context, and that meant that the necessary sort of sublimation of autonomy that is required to like effectively generate like a politics that can be enacted that didn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's not all that different from the peasantry in the Russian Revolution, trying to win them over when they were off trying to produce profits on their own and stuff.
Which they tend to just need a market to sell and not getting fucked over too bad by creditors, and it's kind of essentially is what the peasant position boils down to, like transhistorically, you know. So I think it'd be kind of interesting, you know, we're kind of like talking a little bit about like class formation, you know, of the early republic, and I think that's a thing that Beard hits on pretty early, being a, you know, materialist kind of historian. And he uses the word personality, which I had never seen previous to this book, which he like almost exclusively uses to discuss like capital, basically. But have y'all ever seen that? Am I just like a fucking idiot? Have y'all ever seen the word personal?
That's an archaic term. It's basically,
I had never seen it.
His point is that there's like real property, like which is land, and he kind of has this like romance with the agrarian class, which I think is really obscures a lot of things. But he sees, you know, he calls it realty, I think, like, you know, the subsistence farmers were this, you know, real property owners, and that money capital, which he calls personal, I don't know why he calls it that, I guess it was the term at the time, are these, you know, fake property holders that were screwing everyone over. And I think it was, you know, basically within the context of the early 20th century, you know, quote unquote progressivism, which, you know, at the time, even President Wilson was considered a progressive, even though he, like the Jeffersonians, was a super fucking racist.
Yeah, I suppose it, you know, still the interests of much of the progressive party would have been agrarian in nature, and you kind of want to build those inroads. I think actually, you know, the Beard's thing actually kind of reminds me of Aristotle's distinction between like, you know, being the economy of the home and being able to produce one for oneself, and the economy of like money and money changing and speculation, which is like a big feature of this book. And it's like, I guess still, I mean, people kind of, it's still like a thing that you see socialists sometimes kind of enter into this almost kind of nostalgic desire to kind of return to the like 1945 to 1975 golden era, you know, against against, you know, financialization, that like can't we just go back to a kind of unionized productive capitalism at least?
Well, yeah, there's also the trend of romanticism of like the pre-capitalist relations, which, you know, the opposite of progressive, even if they might be democratic in some sense.
But all this is just to say that one of the big features, we talked a bit about this huge depression, right? Which Christian Parenti in his book Radical Hamilton says this potentially as bad as the Great Depression is like a 20% per capita decline in income. This massive debt crisis. The Articles of Confederation are completely incapable of reining in these troubles and these issues. A lot of imports from England, so there's a kind of inability for like domestic manufacture to kind of compete, et cetera, et cetera. And a big part of this was this massive amount of speculation, monetary speculation, which Beard really makes an argument that, okay, the Constitution remedies this by lending legitimacy, federal legitimacy to creditors, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the attendees and framers were themselves holders of securities, which is like one of the big themes of the book, is who holds securities and in whose interest is a centralized federal system going to secure the, you know, interest of the creditor above the debtor class, which had kind of taken over some local state governments and it actually had managed to produce alleviation for themselves. And this was a big part of like big part of the economic impetus for the creation of the Constitution. I just thought that was kind of interesting because I had not known that previously.
Yeah, he says something. I think he finds that something like 40 out of the 50. First of all, there were only 55 guys who were there drafting the Constitution. That seems like not a lot compared to, you know, who was involved in the Continental Congress and all that. But he says that 40 out of 50 of them were like creditors and holders of those bonds and stock. And I think it's like around the same time that the New York Stock Exchange is created and stuff like that. And I know, like, I tried to read a couple of the like reactionary criticisms of his work, and one of them was saying like, oh well, he's just like looking at individual properties. How do we know that these people were only motivated by their personal wealth, and that just totally misses the point, because I mean, I think the connection between a specific class and its position in political power is not to further your wealth as an individual, but to protect political power for your class as a whole. So sometimes you take deals that won't necessarily be good for you, like this guy, what was his name, Robert Morris, who financed basically the entire United States at the beginning and died penniless. But I just thought that was a really dumb critique of his work.
Yeah, it implies that there isn't a project. I mean, you have to do that though if you're trying to argue that history is about ideas. Like it has to be about people coming together to argue for something that is an idea that compels them beyond their own interests and beyond even their understanding of their interests, which obviously is incoherent, because what is the question always that has to be answered is what is actually going to be enforcing that, and how would it ever survive contact with material interests?
Yeah, there's even a part that the book kind of opens. There's a quote by James Madison that I was just trying to find, but I couldn't actually find it, in which Madison talks about Madison lays out an extremely kind of materialist view of what government is. It's almost like Lassallean or something. It kind of, the government sort of combines all the interests of the populace. But of course, Madison really talks about it's like money interest. I
think I have the quote.
You got okay. Spit, brother.
It's from Federalist 10, and it's basically like he's kind of giving like a historical materialist analysis, which is kind of the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, mercantile interest, moneyed interest, with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various interfering interests form the principal task of modern legislation and involves a spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. Of course, people from his class would think that the property people are the virtuous and who deserve to be the ruling class.
Still do.
So it's funny that there is almost this... from Madison, this acknowledgement of like the material reality of politics.
Yeah, it's the unalloyed reality, which is that the fundamental justification for any ruling elite is tautological. It always boils down to, at foundation, we're in charge because we're in charge. That's it. You create whatever mechanism of religious or civic ideology to mask that, but that is the undeniable reality. And the way that the contradictions of the Constitution played out over time, the way that the conflicts emerge over time, and as they emerge, they're camouflaged with sectional sectional conflict and other ways that the fundamental justification is buried, really has led to this point where we have been fully soaked so much in this stuff that we're, for the most part, like as a country, unable to see anything for as it is. And I think that if there is a genius to the Constitution, it is that it recognized, like the framers, the Madison and those guys recognized that given the massive canvas of the American continent, that whatever implicit contradictions were inherent in the system they were creating, that they could bet that any terms that they needed to worry about and could imagine for themselves, they could be sublimated by the continued settlement and parceling out of that land. And they were correct for the most part. I mean, even the Civil War, for all its horror and blood, in retrospect, it becomes the catalyst for the creation of the United States as a modern country.
Yeah, and isn't this like kind of, it's kind of like similar to the Constitution as a document, like reflects this desire to like sublimate any kind of energy. Like, what is it? Madison says, like, our ambition is to stifle ambition, this kind of thing. And the document itself is like a fucking Winchester mystery house of corridors, opportunities, and things that don't really lead anywhere. And it's designed, to be an extraordinarily, to make an extraordinarily conservative government, one that runs like molasses, down to the fact that, there's one of the framers directly refers to the Senate as the chamber of wealth. It's where we get to have our say. Which is I don't know, just frankly not democratic. Yeah,
and it only gets more and more. It's a machine that only gets more and more broken as time goes on. And you brought up the Civil War. It's like it needs a full scale, basically a revolution, to actually be amended in any significant way. I mean, you need state, like 2/3 of state legislatures. It's crazy. It's like almost impossible to amend. So
2/3 to amend, and I think the consent of every state to actually change the nature of the Senate or something like this. So it's basically Daniel Lazar, who's actually written for Cosmonaut. So shout out Daniel Lazar. But he has he has several pieces in Jackman, which I've read. But the gridlock, is not. It's like the stalemate is so ingrained that even though there are these corridors which, if danced around, potentially could maybe create certain changes to the way that the Constitution is presents itself for the Senate or whatnot. It's effectively completely immobile. It's effectively entirely set in stone. And this is by design. It's designed to be just like a statue, like a museum piece. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because I think it's kind of interesting. I remember reading a Victor Berger, not the filmographer for Tim Heidecker, obviously, but the Victor Berger of the Socialist Party, Milwaukee, I think. Yeah, German Milwaukee brother, our supine friend, Victor Berger. But he has a great little piece called "Abolish the Senate," which rocks. And I think it's especially fun because I think at the time he was dancing around being a member of the House, which is pretty funny. But in it, he directly refers to the Senate as being like the House of Lords, or this upper chamber. And I remember the first time I read that, I thought, surely it's not that direct, but it is, and it's when you read about the Senate even cursorily, you get the impression that it's directly based off of, the House of Lords, and this idea that property needs to be protected. And that's why it was, senators were elected until the 17th Amendment, elected by state legislators for terms of 6 years, while the House of Representatives staggered 6 years, and the House of Representatives only but 2, filtering through, the common, I think what Madison calls the sentiments, so these common passing fads, which need to be entertained just enough to keep at bay the potential of another revolution, or another Shays or whatever. But it's very much set in stone, all that stuff.
Yeah, I think that, this is really, everything we've been talking about is the reason that we have to operate like with the assumption and raise the demands for like constitutional disloyalism. I think it's really important that the socialist movement articulates an opposition to the Constitution, because that's where the entire rule of law comes from. And if you want to actually set up a democratic society, a socialist society, your main opposition is, one, the rule of law, the standing army, in the bureaucracy. And I think it all comes from the Constitution, and that's why, at least legally, why the United States is such a fucked up place.
The United States has but there's a certain amount of the world's lawyers that are from the United States. It's an absurd plurality of lawyers. I can't remember the exact number, but it's kind of hilarious. And it's just because our system is so ridiculous and it's set up by lawyers, which that's enough reason to be skeptical.
Yeah. I think it is something like a crazy number, like 1/3 of the world's lawyers are in the United States.
Yeah, it's something like that. Guys at home, listen, fact check that one. Don't go around saying 1/3 or 2/3. Go ahead and fact check it. And then you can go around saying
95% of lawyers to have ever lived are in America.
That's way more than 2/3. Holy shit.
No, I made that up.
Okay.
That was a good one. Yeah, I don't know. Is it possible to get out of our, constitutional crisis?
I mean, we kind of had our real chance to get out of our constitutional crisis with the Civil War. The Civil War should have ended with the destruction of the Constitution, because the very fact of the war was the final evidence for the Constitution's insufficiency. And the fact that we didn't get that has been one of the key constraints on the political progress of the United States, and one of the big answers to the question of why we've never really had a socialist party or socialist politics in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read something by Matt Karp on how Lincoln had to actually just actively ignore the Supreme Court for, what was it? I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was during the Civil War. Something going on where the Supreme Court ruled against him, and he actually just totally ignored it, and nothing happened because they couldn't do anything. If people didn't accept their legitimacy, then they couldn't do anything.
The Dred Scott decision was conceived by Tawney and those guys as a method to put the entire slavery question to bed. And it ended up not mattering at all because there was a real political contest that had gone beyond that constraint. And when people talk about how we're now at sort of the hostages of courts, it really just speaks to how depoliticized we are. Because in the absence of any kind of real political articulation in this among the people, then these institutions end up sort of governing automatically as zombies.
Yeah, and why do you think it is that we didn't end up with a new constitution? Because there was Reconstruction going on for 12 years or 15 years, something like that, before it was rolled back.
Well, I think what you had there is the same problem that you have during the constitutional era, the inability of the small farmers who make up the majority of any kind of a plebeian, percentage of the population, like non-rulers, and which was divided regionally and by race, and with the urban proto-working class, and you did not see a real alliance there forming until well after Reconstruction, well after the moment of fluidity that could have led to a real challenge to the constitutional order had already subsisted or already been surpassed by time, and that. And I think what it boils, I get on this, but I think that mechanism of free real estate in America has been at every key moment the thing that has prevented the emergence of a self-conscious class politics in time anyway to really affect and really challenge for power. By the time you see by the time you see a real like working class politics emerge in this country, it's in the 30s, by which time it is able to be subsumed within this long-standing institution of the Democratic Party as one of several subsidiary coalition members. And that meant that they were never really going to be able to challenge for power. They could only ever challenge for a share of profits, but on the terms of capital, which of course changed as the conditions changed.
Right, and you know when the frontier closes, you have, you know, several decades before really the small family farmer or whatever really gets put out of business by the increasing monopolization of agriculture and industrialization of agriculture. And in some sense, you get kind of a transfer of this like agrarian, you know, middle class to the kind of small business owner.
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely, like the small business took over for smallholding when smallholding was no longer viable. The idea of American independence and liberty, which is subsistence outside of the labor relation, persisted in this idea of entrepreneurship and still does. But I mean, the way to understand the crisis of American politics is the foreclosure of any of these possibilities, with nothing filling in the gap, with nothing now at this late date, with capitalism now totalized as a world system, and with America no longer able to dictate their access to resources independently, that the constitutional framework, which depended upon and assumed as its baseline this sort of endless fecundity, is now at a point of final critical crisis.
Yeah, and it just gets worse and worse as more states are added in, as we become more populous. I mean, I think what the population of the United States in 1776 was like 8 million, I think. You know, that's North Carolina has more people than that. It's absurd. And you know, now you have, you know, obviously the big, I mean, even liberals acknowledge this, although they don't take it to the root with the Constitution. But I mean, one of the big rots of this country is the fact that, you know, Wisconsin and these, you know, Wyoming, these like, you know, states, you know, you can have, you know, basic 11%, 16% of the population veto and call shots for the rest. And you have states like California and New York with massive amounts of people. You know, California, if it was a country, would be you know, a contender for, you know, having one of the world's most powerful economies. You know, it's like, but within the federal system as it exists, these people are deprived of their kind of, you know, right of representation, more or less, which keeps in power a lot of your, you know, kind of nasty anti-democratic Republicans who aren't really representing that many people. They're vastly overrepresented, considering the amount of people that disagree with them or would like to not see them leaders of the country. And I guess that really comes back to the sort of the checks and balances thing, which is just it's referenced as, yeah, I mean, as being practically ordained, but at the end of the day, it's a fetish, you know. And I couldn't help but think a little bit about Marx and the Civil War in France, and I think I used to be really hesitant about Marx's own prescriptions about like unicameral legislation and the sort of abolition of checks and balances in favor of it, you know, standing parliament and so on, or standing legislative, not really parliament, but standing legislator. Because I kind of read into that, you know, the demise of the Soviet system throughout the 1920s, and the sort of trajectory of the Sovnarkom and the Soviets themselves as bodies, and an eventual decay into from kind of partyarchy to this Stalinist clique and so on. But it wasn't until later that I sort of understood that Marx's own critique of bourgeois constitutionalism was precisely out of the fear of an executive tyrant, or the inability of like a legislator to halt the power of an executive. But I feel like in the United States, you almost have kind of the opposite problem of an executive tyrant, which is that you have a tyranny of immovable institutions. It's perfectly tyrannical. It's perfectly tyrannical because if you are serious about reversing the ills of this country and the ills which are produced by these institutions, then you do have to take a hatchet to the entire fucking Constitution. And where on earth does one go from I care about voter suppression, or I care about such and such an issue, environment, labor protection, policing? Where on earth do you go from that and on a mass scale generate a fervent attack on the Constitution? Like, that is such a massive leap,
Yeah, because it's a machinery that makes it really easy to roll back, legislative victories, like, something like the PRO Act or something. If there's a Republican Congress that gets elected in 2, 4, 6, 8 years, it'd be really easy to roll something like that. And they did. That's what the Taft-Hartley Act was after, what was it, the Wagner Act? It was like only a couple of years later that they rolled half of it back and created right-to-work states.
What about the $15 minimum wage, where you supposedly have a president who supports it, and you have...
Oh, yeah, well, he doesn't, obviously.
Well, not really, but that's what he fucking ran on, and then his party's in charge and they support it, and it's to the last absolute final barrier, and yet we don't have it. Why? It's because you can always turn around, and Kamala Harris did this. She said, well, there are these procedures that we ought to observe and whatnot. And it was the Senate, who gives a fuck? What was, do y'all remember what this parliamentarian, and you can appeal to those systems and alleviate oneself of any complicity. It's just the system. That's how it works. And these are the rules, and, that we have to observe. And it totally rids any of these ghouls from complicity for not following with their fucking promises. You know what I mean? On a basic, you're elected as a tribune of the people. You're elected on a mandate, and you have an imperative. And it's like you can always just wave it away.
Right. I guess my question is, if we have, if it takes a revolutionary crisis like the Civil War to even have the emergence of a possibility of a new constitution, of overthrowing the Constitution, right? Do we still have that, the tyranny of the petty bourgeois class, who will be more likely to not come up with something better in the case of some sort of crisis, which is bound to happen at some point, or do we have actually, like we're seeing a lot of the professional class people become proletarianized in a way because of the crisis of neoliberalism. So I guess just that's a thought to put out there. Like, are we becoming more like industrializing Europe, where we're really being cleaved into the more proletarian and bourgeois classes at this point, or do we still have this kind of wide swath of American self-sufficiency and petty bourgeois class going on?
Well, that's the source of the crisis, is that we don't, like, that there is no more conditions. The conditions can no longer support the luxury of the American. I mean, the American dream defined was always been the place where you don't have to answer to anybody, either because you can grow your own food or you can set your own hours, and that aperture is closing, and that means that the constitutional system has reached a final crisis, and that's why, as frustrating and scary as it is to live in this moment, it's also important to recognize that any possibilities for positive change are going to be found in the same crises that are so seemingly unsurmountable.
Right. I guess it's kind of like that's what they're appealing to the whole thing with, being a so-called gig worker, the Uber and Lyft drivers. But I think it's so hollow, because everyone who works some shitty job like that knows that it's just
that dog don't bark.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's so flexible. It's great.
One thing I did think, and this is slightly off topic, but I think it's kind of interesting, is we just did the interview with Helen Yaffa not too long ago, and people are getting Cuba pilled. Obviously, blowback's doing the Cuba one, and I've been reading, about the Cuban Constitution, which also has, checks and balances in indirect elections. For instance, most the Cubans don't really directly elect their president, but it's rather kind of selected among the National Assembly and so on. Municipal elections are very grassroots, however, but I thought it was kind of interesting to compare the checks and balances of the United States constitutional system, which is devised in order to kind of maintain the innate conservatism in the interest of capital, and property and wealth and personality and et cetera. And the Cuban system, which has checks and balances precisely so that the United States won't, send however, $10 million and buy an election, or manage to work its way up and, assassinate high-ranking leaders, which, kind of endlessly has tried to do and probably will continue to do until the United States, crumbles. But I think it's kind of interesting to compare two constitutions that are basically serving the opposite purpose, but find some, there's some ways in which they're a little bit similar, but for basically the opposite reason, which is they kind of have to protect themselves from something. And in the United States case, it's literally protecting wealth from democracy, and it's insulating markets from democratic imperative. And in Cuba, it's insulating democracy and insulating socialism as a system from all-out war from without. But that's just something that I kept thinking about as I was reading. It's not really like that related to what you guys were talking about, but
I guess one positive outcome of the final constitutional crisis of the United States, if that's what we're predicting, even if there is no working class ready to come and take the helm, is that it'll create a vacuum internationally where people in other countries will at least be able to maybe come to power on a working class program without at least the United States coming to or having enough military power and state being a world system behemoth to stop every single one. So even if we're fucked here, maybe people in other countries will have a chance.
It's sort of the dark kernel of truth of third worldism, is stupid as some of it is, and the sort of idea. I mean, Matt, you were actually talking about this on your the Kush vlog. You're talking about this sort of how outdated the idea of the kind of proletarian aristocracy and this as it pertains to kind of third worldism. But I think that's one aspect of it that I sort of am somewhat sympathetic to, that if the United States were to have some kind of really fracturing event, that it would at least open up space for the rest of the world to kind of breathe in terms of its working class organizations. That's actually being very, very maybe quixotic. I mean, it's to assume that something way worse doesn't happen, pretty much immediately, which I imagine would actually, based on how things go, I mean, I don't see why it would get better,
I mean, there's never any reason to think things will get better, but you have to.
Thanks for coming on and giving us your time. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it a great deal.
Great. Thank you very much.
Get a kick from cocaine.
Hold it. What the hell is that shit?
Thanks a lot for listening, comrades, and thanks a lot to Matt for guest starring and coming on. we have a Patreon where you can access episodes early, usually by a couple of days. Different tiers will also get you into our Discord server. You can get swag from us. I believe we have pins and buttons, bookmarks. We also have a publishing series where we're publishing old, forgotten classics of Marxism. I think up next is Bukharin's Historical Materialism, so that's going to be really great. And until next time, see you then.
I'm in a song, a real song.